How you doing there? Welcome back to Babble on Talmud. Today we're studying Daf Tzadi, Daf 90 of Masechta Chullin. How exciting is that? Up to Daf 90. Daf 90 of Masechta Chullin. Unbelievable. We're moving and shaking here in Masechta Chullin. I'm thrilled. Chevra, first of all, two announcements. Firstly, my apologies for getting out the daf so late today. It's just things have just been crazy. I was out last night for Simchas, thank God for good things. I'm sorry, I'm a little bit late on the recording. I certainly hope that next week we'll be able to get a bit of a reset and get push things a little bit earlier again. That's announcement number one. Announcement number two, big joy in Babble on Talmud. Our friend Reb Jonathan Shapiro, Mazel Tov, he on his chasana on this past Sunday, he got married. Unbelievable. We are all thrilled here at Babble on Talmud. So, Reb Jonathan, just wishing you a whole life of just like good stuff, happiness, and of course, learning and Babble on Talmud. And we love you and we wish you all the best. Friends, today we're learning Daf 90 of Masechta Chullin. We're really getting into Perek Gid Hanasheh. Yesterday we kind of dipped our feet a little bit. We had a look at a slide. We learned the Mishnah. Today we are going to be learning about what the Mishnah had talked about, that the Gid Hanasheh applies to Mukdashin, to Korbanis, and we're really going to be exploring the implications of that. We'll essentially have two big sections, and we kind of have to do most of Pei Tesamud Beis really as well. How Gid Hanasheh applies to Kodashim. Now, when the Mishnah says that Gid Hanasheh applies to Korbanos, applies to Kodashim, what does the Mishnah mean by that? That's question number one and section number one. Section number two is how Gid Hanasheh applies to Korban Olahs, right? Because after all, the pasuk says, Akein lo yochlu b'nei Yisrael, that the Yidden shouldn't eat the Gid Hanasheh. What about a Korban Olah where the Yidden don't eat the Korban Olah? So how does the Gid Hanasheh apply, right? How does it or doesn't it apply to a Korban? How does the Gid Hanasheh apply to the Korban Olah, since Korban Olahs are not eaten by the Bnei Yisrael? Friends, and then at the end we get to like a little bit of it's hard to define quite Aggadata, but anything that isn't like straight up like Gemara, I guess just gets lumped into like Aggadata. But yeah, we kind of like darshan a few things at the end, which I think is interesting. Friends, join me. Let's have a great time learning Daf Tzadi, Daf 90 of Masechta Chullin. Friends, we begin on Daf Pei Tes, Amid Beis, at the beginning of the Gemara. As I mentioned yesterday, I stopped right after the Mishnah because, as you're going to see now, once you start this Gemara, you got to run with it for a little bit. So right into kind of Daf Tzadi. Here we go. We're going to start on Daf Pei Tes Amid Beis at the Gemara, Mukdashin Pshita. So the Mishnah had said, right, I'm reading for the beginning of the Mishnah. Gid Hanasheh noyeg ba'aretz u'b'chutz la'aretz b'fnei habayis v'shlo b'fnei habayis b'chulin u'v'mukdashin. That Gid Hanasheh, right, the prohibition against consuming the sciatic nerve applies both chulin, okay, if you shecht an animal and you can eat it for lunch, so don't eat the sciatic nerve, and it applies to korbanos. So the Gemara asks, of course it applies to korbanos. What's a korban? A korban is an animal that you said, I'm going to offer you as a korban. Well, before you said, I'm going to offer you as a korban, it had a Gid Hanasheh, and that Gid Hanasheh was aser. That Isser of Gid Hanasheh doesn't go away when you're makdish it as a korban. So I don't understand what the shaila is. Obviously, Gid Hanasheh applies to chulin, and also, once you've made it into korban as well, the Gid Hanasheh continues to apply. Shouldn't that be obvious? Mukdashim pshita, mishum de'akdishe pokalei Isser Gid Hanasheh. I don't understand. Just because he's makdish it, the Isser of Gid Hanasheh somehow disappears. V'chi tema, and if you're going to say, I'm going to add a few words here. Kasavar Tana Didon. Well, the Tana of our Mishnah holds Yesh begidin beno sein tam ve'osi iser mukdashim v'chayola iser gid daram pa pam 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 param pam. Beautiful. So the Gemara suggests that this is what the Tana of our Mishnah is saying. Tana of our Mishnah is saying this. If you eat the gid hanasheh, well, what's the gid hanasheh? It's a sciatic nerve. So if you remove the sciatic nerve from an animal, and you have a plate of sciatic nerve, and you eat that, so you're going to be chayav a lav of alkin lo yochlu b'nei Yisrael gid hanasheh. Don't eat the gid hanasheh. You'll be violating that lav. Don't eat the gid hanasheh. You violated that lav. You ate it. Now, what if? Let me ask you a question. What if that gid hanasheh belongs to an animal that you were makdish? What if you went over to an animal and you said, I'm going to offer you as a korban? So you just makdish this animal. As we're going to learn, after Masechta Chullin, we're learning Masechta Bechoros. After Masechta Bechoros, we learn Masechta Arachin, Tmura, Kresus, and then Me'ilah. A few months away from Masechta Me'ilah. Maybe 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 months away from Masechta Me'ilah. Once you're makdish a korban, an animal as a korban, you're not allowed to eat it. You're not allowed to get benefit from it. That would be what's called Me'ilah. Getting benefit from hektish. So you'd be unable to eat this animal. So now what if this gid hanasheh was removed from an animal that you were makdish as a korban? Okay, so you go over to an animal, you say, I'm going to offer you as a korban. Okay, instead of offering it as a korban, you shecht it, and you remove the gid hanasheh, and you have a plate that contains the gid hanasheh, and you eat the gid hanasheh. So of course you're going to be over the lav of don't eat the gid hanasheh. What about, will you also be over on Me'ilah? Will you also be getting benefit from kodesh? From getting benefit from this animal that you set aside to be a korban that you're not allowed to get benefit from? So it depends. Depends. How do we view gidin, nerves, sinews? Do we say yesh begidin b'nosei tam or ein begidin b'nosei tam? Let's say ein begidin b'nosei tam. That sinews, nerves, the gid hanasheh, doesn't impart any flavor. It doesn't have any of the flavor of the meat. Well, if this gid hanasheh, it contains no flavor of meat, well then, right, so you're not allowed to eat the meat of this animal. You're eating a sinew, you're eating the gid hanasheh. And the gid hanasheh has none of the flavor of the meat, so you won't be getting any benefit, any hana, from the meat of this animal. So you would be in violation of eating the gid hanasheh, but in terms of getting benefit from hektish, from what you were makdish, you're not getting benefit from it. Ein begidin b'nosei tam. But if you say yesh begidin b'nosei tam, well then you are getting benefit from the animal, and it is going to be, or you are going to be getting pleasure, getting hana from this animal that you're not allowed to be getting hana from. So the Gemara suggests that maybe when the Mishnah says that gid hanasheh applies to mukdashin, the chiddush is that if you're a makdish an animal, and now you're not allowed to get any benefit from it, that would be me'ilah, and then you shecht it, and you remove the sciatic nerve, and you eat the sciatic nerve, in addition to being chayav for eating the sciatic nerve, you'll also be chayav for getting benefit from kodashim, because what the Mishnah is saying, and as Rashi points out, what it's saying is, number one, that yesh begidin b'nosei tam. It's teaching us that sinews impart flavor, and therefore by eating the gid hanasheh, in addition to being chayiv for eating the gid hanasheh, you also will be chayiv for getting benefit from hektish. And number two, Rashi says, number two, what it teaches is isser chal al isser, that you can combine, that you can have one isser applied to another isser, that you have the isser of gid hanasheh, and then the isser of don't benefit from kodashim can be added on top of gid hanasheh. So it's two chidushim there. So again, says the Gemara, maybe what the Mishnah is teaching us is that yesh begidin b'nosei tam, that sinews impart flavor, and the sciatic nerve it contains the flavor of the meat. Vasi isur mukdashin, and the isur of don't get benefit from kodashim, v'chayil isur gid, and it applies and it's added on to the isur of don't eat the gid hanasheh. So maybe that is the chiddush of the Mishnah. But says the Gemara that can't be the chiddush of the Mishnah, because the Mishnah says that gid hanasheh applies to kodashim, not the other way around. What we just described was the other way around. Again, I'm going to back up a line, right? If you can say yesh begin benosin tam ve'osi isur mukdashim v'chayil isur gid, right? That would be what we just described, is that the isur of don't eat kodesh is applied to the isur of gid hanasheh. But what we're looking for is the opposite. The gid hanasheh applies to mukdashim. So noig begid mi boile. So instead of what our Mishnah says, which is that gid hanasheh applies to mukdashim, this would be mukdashin noig begid. That mukdashin applies to gid, and that's backwards. We need to be applying gid hanasheh to kodashim, not applying kodashim to gid hanasheh. Elo kasover ein begidim benosin tam. Okay, so rather we say that what the Mishnah is teaching is ein begidim benosin tam. What the Mishnah is teaching is that in the same case, right, you set aside an animal to be a korban shlomim, you're not allowed to get any benefit from it. And what we're saying is that if you shecht and you eat the gid hanasheh from this animal that you were makdish, the opposite. We're saying that you're only going to be chayiv for gid hanasheh, you're not going to be chayiv for benefiting from hektish, because ein begidin benosin tam. Mukdashin, and when it comes to mukdashin, isur gid ika, so you'll be in violation of the prohibition against eating the gid hanasheh, isur mukdashin leka, but you won't be in violation of getting prohibited benefit from kodesh. Perfect the Gemara, that can't be. That our Tana holds ein begidim benosin tam, v'savatana didon ein begidim benosin tam. Can we really say that our Tana holds that gidim do not impart flavor? V'atnan, but we learn in a Mishnah and Daf Tzadivav, yarech, if you have the thigh of the animal, shenis bashal ba gid hanasheh, that the sciatic nerve is cooked in the thigh. Im yesh ba b'noisen tam, if the sciatic nerve imparts flavor in the thigh meat, harezo asura, well then the thigh meat is also, because it has the flavor of the gid hanasheh. So clearly the Tana of our Mishnah holds yesh begidin b'nosen tam, that sinews do impart flavor. So you can't answer that the Tana of our Mishnah holds that gidin, nerves, sinews do not impart flavor, when our Mishnah clearly holds that yesh begidim b'nosen tam, that gidim, I'm just going to say gidim, right? Sinews, I think, are technically, I think nowadays we refer to, I looked it up earlier, refer to sinews more as like tendons, and we're here talking about a nerve, but maybe I'll just refer to gidin, which, to use the Gemara's word, or I don't know, nerves or sinews, I don't know. But if I say gidin, it's talking about nerve, sinew stuff, particularly the sciatic nerve now. Anyways, so as we've demonstrated from the Mishnah and Daf Tzadivav, the Tana of our Mishnah holds yesh begidin benosein tam. So we can't. So there goes that option to say that our Mishnah is saying ein begidin benosein tam. Yesh begidin benosein tam. So ella hacha bevaldois kodashim askinon. Okay. Rather, what our Mishnah is talking about when we say that gid hanasheh applies to kodashim, it's saying that it's talking about, you set aside an ew. I choose you. Hey, ew, I choose you to be my new korban shlomim. So our Mishnah is talking about a situation where an ew was set aside to be a korban shlomim, and that ew had a baby. That's what our Mishnah is talking about. That ew had a baby. Now, if a korban shlomim, if an animal set aside to be a korban shlomim has a baby, that baby is also kadosh. V'kasaver noeg b'shlil. And our Mishnah, what it's teaching us by saying that Gid hanasheh applies to kodashim, and we're saying specifically it applies to this baby. So it's teaching us two things. Number one, that Gid hanasheh already applies to a fetus. Number two, v'kasaver valdos kodashim b'mei iman hein kedoshim. That when a kadosh animal gives birth, has a baby, that baby is already kadosh from when it was in its mother's belly. So it's teaching us two things. Number one, you set aside an ewe as a korban shlomim, and that ewe has a baby. Already when that baby is developing inside of the mother, it already has kedusha. It already has holiness because its mother has holiness. And number two, Gid hanasheh already applies to fetuses. And join those two facts together. The Isser Gid, Isser Mukadashin, Bade Adade Ka'asi. That the Isser of the Gid hanasheh and the Isser of don't eat, right? You can't get benefit from hektish, right? I.e., the animal's hektish, and as a Gid hanasheh, those both happen while the baby is developing. And that is why both apply. So meaning, we had asked at the beginning of the Gemara that if you have an animal that you're makdish, well, it had a sciatic nerve before you were makdish it continues to have a sciatic nerve afterwards, so what's the chiddush? So here what we're talking about is a baby that was born already kadosh, and it was born, of course, with a Gid hanasheh. And that what we're saying is, we're teaching two things. Number one, that the holiness of this baby is already from when it is in development. And number two, that the Gid hanasheh, the Isser Gid hanasheh already applies when the baby is in development. And therefore, the Isser Gid hanasheh and the fact that this animal is kadosh and therefore you can't get benefit from it, those are introduced jointly together and therefore both apply. And if you consume the Gid hanasheh of this animal, so we said yesh begidim benosein tam, that these nerves have flavor, and if you eat the nerve of this animal, you will be in violation of both consuming Gid hanasheh and benefiting from this from kodesh from this baby. Frag de Gemara umimotzis mukmas la b'shlil. The only problem is, says the Gemara, you can't be telling me that the chiddush here, when the Mishnah says uf mukdashin, is to teach me that Gid hanasheh applies to fetuses. You can't tell me that when the Mishnah is talking about mukdashin, it's teaching us that the halacha that Gid hanasheh applies to fetuses. Why can't that be what's going on? It can't be what's going on because if you look at the Mishnah, right, the first word on the third line of the Mishnah is mukdashin. If you drop down two lines in the middle of the Mishnah, in the middle of the line and the middle of the Mishnah, it says v'noheg b'shlil. The Gid hanasheh applies to fetuses. Rabbi Yehuda Omer ein noheg b'shlil. Doesn't apply to fetuses. So two lines later in the Mishnah is when we're talking about whether or not Gid hanasheh applies to fetuses. Which means that two lines earlier, when it's talking about mukdashin, it's talking about something else. It's not talking about fetuses. Fetuses is two lines later. Mukdashin is not talking about fetuses then. So again, umimatzis mukmas la b'shlil. How can you tell me that mukdashin is talking about fetuses? V'amidikatani seifa. Two lines later, the Mishnah talks about noig b'shlil. That the Chacham of the Tanakhama says that Gid hanasheh applies to shlil. Michlal, Direisha lab b'shlil askinan, implying that mukdashin earlier in the Mishnah is not yet talking about fetuses. And for the Gemara, the Reisha is talking about fetuses. When it's talking about mukdashin, it's exactly like we said. It's talking about fetuses. Hachi kamar, this is what the Mishnah is saying. Dover zeh, that this concept that we introduced with Mukdashin, that the Gid Anosha already applies to fetuses, by the way, it's a machlokes. It's a machlokes between, right? So meaning, when the Mishnah says b'mukdashin, that Gid Anosha applies to Mukdashin, it's talking about that it applies to the fetus of this that you set aside as a korban shlamim and it has a baby. It applies to the fetus. And then 2 lines later in the Mishnah, it says, by the way, this concept that we mentioned by Mukdashin, that Gid Anosha applies to fetuses, it's actually a machlokes, v'noig b'shlil, Reb Yehuda Omer, ein noig b'shlil, and then the Mishnah elaborates on that machlokes. So again, Hachikamer, this is what's going on in the Mishnah. Dover Zed, this concept that we said by kodashim, that Gid Anosha applies to the fetus, machlokes to Reb Yehuda v'Rabbanon, it happens to actually be a machlokes between Reb Yehuda and the Rabbanon. No, so where are we right now? Where we are is that we're saying when the Mishnah says that Gid Anosha applies to Mukdashin, what it's teaching us is that in a scenario where you were makdish an animal to be, you're makdish an to be a korban shlamim, and that has a baby. So while that baby is developing, 2 things happen. It's already kadosh, and its Gid Anosha is already also as a Gid Anosha, and therefore when this baby is born, if you eat this Gid Anosha of this baby, you will be chayav for eating the Gid Anosha and for getting benefit from kodashim. But now the Gemara says it's not going to work. Can you really say, like we just said, that the kedusha of this baby, while it's being developed, as well as the Gid Anosha are happening, these isurim are being introduced simultaneously? That's right. That's what we've been led to believe until now. That both the Gid Anosha and the kedusha of this baby happen simultaneously as the fetus is developing. There's a hiccup. We learn in the Mishnah Masechta Nazir. Al elu tumos hanazir megaleach. Of course, we know that a Nazir person says, I'm going to be a Nazir. And let's say for 30 days, Stam Nazir Shloshim Yom. So, a Nazir is, of course, right, al nafshus meis lo yavo. I don't know if that's from Nazir or from Kohanim. I'm not sure. But both are not able. Anyways, if a Nazir becomes Tamei Meis, it's a whole story. He's got to start over again. He's got to shave his head again. A whole story. Bring korban. You got to start all over again. So now says the Mishnah, Al elu tumos hanazir megaleach, and the Mishnah in Nazir gives a whole list of different tumas that if a Nazir becomes impure with these impurities, with these tumas hameses, he's got to shave his head, bring korban, start all over again. Al hames, if he touches a corpse, vel kazayis min hames, and a olive's amount from a corpse. V'kashalim, we ask in the Gemara, al kazayis min hames megalech akula lo kol shekin. I don't understand. Why is Mishnah saying, meaning if the Mishnah is going to tell us that if the Nazir touches even just an olive's worth of a corpse, he has to start all over again. So obviously if he touches a whole corpse, he has to start all over again. So why is he saying ala mace vil kazayis min? Tell me kazayis min mace, and I know memela, obviously a whole mace. So v'om Reb Yechanan says Reb Yechanan le'nitzucha ela l'neifel shelenikshru eivar begidin. So you know what the answer is? The answer is that when the Mishnah says that a Nazir starts all over again if he touches a mace, it's talking about a neifel. If there is a miscarriage and there is a fetus that is in an early stage of development and it's got limbs, but it doesn't yet have sinews, doesn't yet have nerves, doesn't have tendons, doesn't have meat. So there's no kazayas of meat on it, but nonetheless, it has the bones on it. Right? It's got its limbs there, no tendons, no meat, no nerves. If a Nazir touches that, so he'll have to start all over again, just like if he touches a kazayis from a corpse. So Ama Isser Mukudashim Kodim. So what do we see from there? We see from the case in Nazir, that it says, you have this fetus that's in a very early stage of development that doesn't yet have gidin, doesn't have sinews, doesn't have nerves. So we see that as the fetus develops, it first develops the limbs and stuff. I didn't actually look this up. Maybe Reb Neil, Sharna, if you have insight for us about the development of fetuses. But the Gemara says what happens is first you have the limbs, and then afterwards come the connections between them and the nerves. So there is a point during the baby's development where it's already a fetus, and therefore it would already have Kedusha in our context, right? You makdish an u to be a korban shlamim, and this u gets pregnant, and this fetus is developing. It doesn't yet have any sinews, doesn't have a gid hanasheh yet, but it's already in development, it's already kadosh, but there is not yet any gid hanasheh yet for there to be usr. Only at a later stage of development are the sinews and the nerves introduced. Which means that at the time they're introduced, the fetus was already holy from the time that it began to develop, but the Isser of Gid hanasheh is coming later. So we were led to believe up until now that, well, there are two things that the Mishnah is teaching us. One is that the Kedusha of the fetus is already when it's developing inside of its mother. And number two, the Gid hanasheh applies to a fetus, and therefore the Gid hanasheh and the Kedusha of the baby are being introduced at the same time while the baby's in development. That's not true. What we just saw from Masechta Nazir is that it's actually incremental. First, the limbs are developed, at which point already there would be Kedusha of this baby and an Isser of getting anal from it. And later on is only when the Gidim develop and when the Isser for the Gid hanasheh would apply. So therefore the concept of, you see, well, they're both happening together, that's why both apply, doesn't really work anymore, because actually Gid hanasheh is late to the party. We'll go weiter. So says the Gemara, Afagab the Isser Mukdashin Kadam, we say Enochinami. Enochinami, you're right. The limbs develop first, which means that the Kedusha of the baby is introduced first. Nonetheless, so Afagab the Isser Mukdashin Kadam, even though the Kedusha it happens first, Osi Isser Gid Chayil Alayu. Nonetheless, when the sinews develop, the prohibition, right, the Isser of Gid hanasheh would still be applied to that of the Isser of Mukdashin. Shekain Isur Noig B'vnei Noach. The answer is because since the Isser of Gid hanasheh is a stringent one, it's a serious one. Why is it a serious one? Because the Gid hanasheh already applied, it's an early lab. It applied to Yaakov Avinu already. Before Matan Torah, Bnei Noach, before we were Am Yisrael, before we received the Torah, it already applied. So that makes Gid hanasheh particularly stringent, particularly serious, and therefore it could be applied even to Kedusha. So if we're talking about, can you apply one Isser to another Isser? If the Isser of the fact that this animal is Kadosh was already in place, can you now add subsequently an additional Isser, a Isser Chalal Isser, add an additional Isser of Gid hanasheh? We say yes, because Gid hanasheh is a stringent one, because it applies even to Bnei Noach before Matan Torah. Okay, fine. So that's what the Mishnah is saying. Okay, so again, so the Mishnah is saying that we have an ewe that you set aside as a korban shlamim. It developed a baby. That baby had kedusha as it was developing. When it got the gid hanasheh was subsequently added to the list of isurim because it is stringent. It applies even to bnei noach. Says the Gemara, wait, another hiccup. One hiccup after the next. That's what happens when you get hiccups. Once you get hiccups, you keep on getting them. Man shamis le'ai svorit. Whose opinion is it? This bnei noach perspective. I'll tell you. Or how about you could tell yourself? Flip to Daf Kuf Amid Beis in the Mishnah. I'm going to read you a Mishnah on Daf Kuf Amid Beis. You could read along. Noyeg b'tahara ve'eino noyeg b'tmeya. Gid hanasheh applies to kosher animals. Gid hanasheh does not apply to non-kosher animals. Rabbi Yehuda says Rabbi Yehuda af b'tmeya. Says Rabbi Yehuda, gid hanasheh also applies to non-kosher animals, and I'll prove it to you. Rabbi Yehuda v'alo mibnei Yaakov nesar gid hanasheh v'adayin be'ema tmeya muteres loid. Because after all, for the bnei Yaakov Avinu's children already had the mitzvah, the prohibition against eating the gid hanasheh, and that was before Matan Torah, and there was not yet a concept of kosher and non-kosher animals. So we see that that's the whole concept of gid hanasheh applying to bnei noach is a Rabbi Yehuda concept. Okay, what's the problem with that? What do you mean, what's the problem with that? Our Mishnah is clearly not Rabbi Yehuda. Why? Well, for one, we're saying that gid hanasheh applies to fetuses. That's our whole thing, right? We're saying that the kedusha is from the fetus, and the gid hanasheh applies to the fetus. As we saw 2 lines later, v'noig b'shlil, Rabbi Yehuda Omer eino noig b'shlil. Rabbi Yehuda argues on that concept. Rabbi Yehuda says gid hanasheh doesn't apply to fetuses. So clearly our Mishnah that we're talking about with mukdashin, and we're saying it's based on the fetus, is not Rabbi Yehuda. So how can we be introducing the whole bnei noach thing, which is a Rabbi Yehuda concept? How can we apply a Rabbi Yehuda concept to a concept that isn't Rabbi Yehuda? That's one proof that our Mishnah is not Rabbi Yehuda, but also because, as the Gemara points out, what does the Gemara say? So man shamislei hai svare. Whose idea is this? The whole bnei noach idea, as we saw in the Mishnah and Daf Kuf Amid Beis, Rabbi Yehuda. It's a Rabbi Yehuda idea. V'masnisim deloik Rabbi Yehuda. Our Mishnah is not Rabbi Yehuda either, as Tosfos points out, like I just said, because we've been talking about the whole fetus thing. But the Gemara points out the Katani that our Mishnah says noig bebehemo v'chayid applies to behemoths and chayes b'yerech shel yamin u'v'yerech shel small, and that there are 2 gid hanashehs in an animal, in the right back leg and the left back leg. And we learned recently that according to Rabbi Yehuda, there is only 1 gid hanasheh in an animal. So clearly, whether you want to prove it from the fact that we're assuming that gid hanasheh applies to a fetus, whether we're bringing it from the fact that the Mishnah says that there are 2 gid hanashehs in an animal, whatever it is, our Mishnah is not Rabbi Yehuda. So how can we be invoking that to explain our Mishnah? We have to rely upon the gid hanasheh being even to the bnei noach, which is a Rabbi Yehuda concept. And for the Gemara, Haitana sorvele kavosi bechadu folagole bechad nish geferlech, answers the Gemara, meh. So what? Yeah, our Mishnah is not Rabbi Yehuda in terms of fetuses, in terms of how many gid hanashehs there are. Clearly, it's not Rabbi Yehuda. But in terms of understanding the concept of mukdashin, yeah, it's true. We do rely upon a principle that Rabbi Yehuda laid out, which is that gid hanasheh applies to bnei noach, and we don't have a problem with relying upon that principle of Rabbi Yehuda. We agree with that, but we disagree with other things. Frag the Gemara aber, but the Gemara asks, Eimer de shamis lei le Rabbi Yehuda b'tmeya de iser lav kodashim de iser karis mi shamis lei. However, the Gemara is still hiccuping, and hiccups that this concept of the bnei noach maybe works for non-kosher animals. Right? We saw the Mishnah and Daf Kuf Amid Beis. It's talking about kosher animals and versus non-kosher animals. Does the gid hanasheh also apply to non-kosher animals? Is it limited to kosher animals? Or does it also apply to non-kosher animals? The Chacham say it doesn't apply to non-kosher animals, it's only kosher animals. Rabbi Yehuda says it even applies to non-kosher animals, and his argument is because Gid Hanasheh was already from pre-Matan Torah, before there was any concept of kosher versus non-kosher animals. Says the Gemara, that's all fine and good when it comes to kosher and non-kosher animals. At the end of the day, eating a non-kosher animal is a lav. Saying that Gid Hanasheh is more chomer than kodashim, and therefore the Isser of Gid Hanasheh can be added and can be chal on the Isser of getting benefit from kodashim, that is a more bold claim. Because kodashim, getting benefit from kodashim conceptually is more than just a lav. Kodashim is a concept that has kares associated with it. Right? A person who's tameh eats kodesh, chayiv kares. Pigel, chayiv kares. No, sir, chayiv kares. There's all sorts of kares associated with kodashim. So while sure, Rabbi Yehuda invokes this concept of bnei noyach to say that Gid Hanasheh can even apply to non-kosher animals, but can we use the same concept that Gid Hanasheh therefore can be applied and chal on the Isser of kodashim, which is more stringent, chiyuv kares? I don't know about that, says the Gemara. So again, Eimer Desham is later Rabbi Yehuda, but Tmeya, okay, Rabbi Yehuda invokes this concept of Gid Hanasheh being stringent because it applies to Bnei Noyach. Sure, based on that he says it applies even to non-kosher animals. This or lav. Today eating a non-kosher is a lav. But kodashim, to say Isser Chalal Isser, Gid Hanasheh applies, is added on even to kodashim. There's a kares. Kodashim is something that has kares associated with it. Mishamsle, would we apply that? Right, remember, we're talking about this baby that's developing, and it's already has kedusha from the time that it starts developing. The Isser Gid Hanasheh only comes later, once the Gid Hanasheh is introduced. Right, once there are gidim. And we're not convinced that Gid Hanasheh, the Isser Gid Hanasheh, would be able to be added to the Isser of getting benefit from Kodesh, which was already in place. So Ella, and with this we conclude with two answers. Answer number one, Hocha b'mivakeres oskinon, dibirechem kadosh. Answer number one, when the Mishnah is talking about mukdashim, it's talking about a bechor, a cow, sheep, goat. We usually work with sheep over here at Babble on Talmud. So, or goats. So if you have an ewe, a regular ewe, you weren't makdish ewe, a regular ewe, and this ewe is giving birth to its firstborn male ewe. A moo. And so this ewe is giving birth to its bechor. So as the next Masechta we're going to learn is bechoris. We'll learn about bechor behema in Masechta Bechoris. So that animal, this bechor, becomes kadosh not merechem. Well, yes, merechem. Not when it's b'mei imo, not when it's developing, but rather berechem, when it's being born. That's when it gets its kedusha. But it's, as we're saying, that Gid Hanasheh already applies to a shlil, already applies to the fetus. So in this case, actually, we're saying by bechor, the kedusha's bechor is only once it's being born does that kedusha kick in, by which point it already had the Gid Hanasheh from when it was developing. So the Gid Hanasheh already applies to the fetus. The kedusha only is applied later when it's being born. And what the Mishnah is saying, that therefore the Gid Hanasheh does in fact apply to this animal, this firstborn that's kadosh with kedusha's bechora. And if you shecht and eat that bechor when you were meant to have offered it as a korban, and you eat the Gid Hanasheh, you will be in violation of Gid Hanasheh and getting benefit from this bechor, from kodashim. So again, we're talking about an ewe that is giving birth to its firstborn, the berechem kadosh, that the firstborn becomes kadosh only while it's being born, not before then, at which point it already had the Isser of Gid Anosha. By same, alternatively, valdos kodashim bavayoson in kodashim. Alternatively, we can go back to the initial concept of, well, one of our initial, the concept we've been working with, where you were makdish an u, and that u had a baby. However, unlike we've been assuming until now that the baby's already kadosh when it's in development, no. Valdos kodashim bavyoson in kadoshim. When they are born, they become kadosh, not before then. So therefore, this fetus that was developing inside of this u, that you makdish the u, and it had a baby and it was in development, that baby, as it's developing, was not kadosh, and yet the sinew, the Gid Hanasheh, as it developed, became asur as the Gid Hanasheh, and when it was born, it then got the kedusha from its mother, and again, both the Gid Hanasheh and the kedusha will apply. And if you shech this animal and eat it and eat the Gid Hanasheh, you will be in violation of both Gid Hanasheh as well as getting benefit from a korban. Okay, gewaldig. Fine. So that is essentially where we stand here in understanding what does the Mishnah mean by Gid Hanasheh applying to Mukdashin. We gave two answers. Either it's talking about a Bechor, which the Kedusha of a Bechor is applied when it takes effect as it's being born. Alternatively, we could say that animals only that an animal that's being born to a mother that is kadosh only becomes kadosh as it is being born, not while it is being developed. In both cases, whether the bechor or whether this animal being born to an ewe, the Gid Hanasheh was developed and was already asur as a fetus, whereas the kedusha only is added subsequently. All right, friends, and now we move on to how Gid Hanasheh applies to korban olahs, because of course korban olahs we don't eat. So if the Gid Hanasheh is all about not eating the Gid Hanasheh, well, we don't eat korban olahs anyway. So how does Gid Hanasheh apply there? Amr B'chia says, Bar Yosef, Loshon Ele Kodashim Cholin, says B'chia Bar Yosef that Gid Hanasheh is only relevant to korbanos that can be eaten. So korban shlamim, for example, a person brings a korban shlamim, so if they want to eat the korban shlamim, they have to remove the Gid Hanasheh. You can't eat the Gid Hanasheh of a korban shlamim. Aval kodashim she'en nechalim, but a korban olah, for example, in iser gid noeg bayin. There's no issue with the Gid Hanasheh when it comes to a korban olah. There's no concerns about Gid Hanasheh by a korban olah, which nobody's eating. It's all just burnt in the mizbeach. Rabbi Yochanan Omar echad kodashim nechalin, v'echad kodashim she'en nechalin. Isser Gid Noeg Boyin. Whereas Rabbi Yochanan disagrees and he says Gid Hanasheh is just as relevant to a korban olah as it is to any other korban that is eaten. Amar Papa says, Papa v'lei plige, says Papa that they agree lemaise. They're just talking about different contexts. Then when Rabbi Bar Yosef says that the Gid Hanasheh doesn't apply, and when Rabbi Yochanan says Gid Hanasheh does apply to olahs, they're talking about different parts of different angles of the olah. Kanda al koso, kanda al oso. In terms of if one were to eat the Gid Hanasheh of a korban olah, both agree that you would be chayiv makis for eating the Gid Hanasheh. They also agree that liha aloso, there is no issue with bringing the hind legs of a animal onto the mizbeach with its Gid Hanasheh. So when you have a korban olah, right? So you have a sheep, for example, as a korban olah, and you cut it into its parts, you break it down, and you have its legs. So you bring the hind legs up to the top of the mizbeach. You don't have to first remove the Gid Hanasheh before bringing up the hind legs. You can bring up the hind legs to the mizbeach with the Gid Hanasheh inside of them and burn them. So everyone agrees. So basically, when Reb Chia Bar Yosef says that there's no gid hanasheh, it means that there's no issue with bringing the gid hanasheh up to the top of the mizbeach as part of the hind legs of the animal, of the olah. And when Reb Yochanan says that the gid hanasheh does apply to an olah, it means that if you eat the gid hanasheh of a korban olah, you'll be chayiv makis for eating the korban, the gid hanasheh, for eating the gid hanasheh, and everybody agrees to both of those concepts. They don't argue kan lechalzo v'kan la'aloso. That when it comes to lechalzo, to remove, right? When it comes to korban olah, do you need to remove the gid hanasheh from the korban olah before bringing it to the top of the mizbeach? No, you don't. Everyone agrees with that. Even Rabbi Yochanan, everyone agrees that when Reb Chia Bar Yosef says that there's no concept of gid hanasheh by korban olah, it means you don't need to remove, there's no issue, you don't need to remove the gid hanasheh from the hind legs of the sheep, let's say, before bringing it to the top of the mizbeach. When Reb Chia Bar Yosef says that there's no issue of gid hanasheh by korban olah, it means that you just bring up the legs. No, there's no issue, but there's no problem with the fact that the gid hanasheh is inside of them. And that when Rabbi Yochanan says that there is an issue of the gid hanasheh by korban olah, everyone agrees that what he's talking about is that if the gid hanasheh got separated from the leg, then everyone agrees you would not just bring up the gid hanasheh alone to the top of the mizbeach. We would say gid hanasheh applies there. Hey, it's the gid hanasheh. Don't be bringing it to the top of the mizbeach on its own. Okay, so when Reb Chia Bar Yosef says gid hanasheh doesn't apply, it means that when the gid hanasheh is still in the leg, don't worry about it. Just bring it all to the top of the mizbeach. If the gid hanasheh is separated from the leg, then don't bring just the sciatic nerve to the top of the mizbeach. Okay. Rav Nachman Bar Yitzchak says, Rav Nachman Bar Yitzchak la'aloso pliges. So it says Rav Nachman Bar Yitzchak, he points out that it's actually a machlokes tanoim about le'aloso. This concept of when you're cutting up, when you're breaking down a korban olah, so you have a sheep and you're breaking it down into its legs and its head and all sorts of stuff. So this idea of the hind legs, do you need to remove the gid hanasheh from the hind legs before burning them on the mizbeach, or do you just burn the hind legs with the gid hanasheh? It's actually a machlokes tanaim. We were just talking about, we were saying, no, it's nishkefelch, it's no problem. As long as you bring the whole leg, bring it with the sciatic nerve inside. You don't have to remove it. This is actually machlokes tanaim. The Sanya, they were learning a brisa. One pasuk says, "V'iktir hakohen es hakol hamizbecha," that the kohen burns everything on the mizbeach by korban olah. L'rabos atzomos, even the bones, v'agidin, and the sinews, including the gid hanasheh, all the sinews, v'akarnayim, the horns, v'atzlafayim, the hooves, yochel afilu pershu. What if the sinews, and we're not davka talking about the gid hanasheh, we'll specifically talk about the gid hanasheh once we flip the page onto Tzadi Yomid Beis. But what if, so we had said that the kohen, right, es hakol, the kohen burns everything on the mizbeach, including sinews. But what if the sinews got separated from the rest of the meat of the olah? Would you burn the sinews on the mizbeach on their own? Again, we're not talking about the sciatic nerve specifically, but any sinews. Another pasuk says that by korban olah, you're going to burn just the meat. You'll do zrikas adam, and you'll burn just the meat. No bones, no sinews, no hoofs, no horns. Okay, well, if we're saying it's just meat, so could it mean that you have to remove the bones and the sinews, etc., before bringing them to the mizbeach, bring the meat to the mizbeach? Well, we had quoted already a pasuk earlier that everything goes in the mizbeach. Okay, it's not new. How do we reconcile these things? Mechubarin yalu pershu afilu brosha shemizbeach yerdu. The answer is, when the bones and the sinews are still connected to the animal. So when the sinews are still inside of the limbs, bring them up to the top of the mizbeach. Once the sinews get separated from the rest of the limbs, if they are separated, don't bring them to the top of the mizbeach. And if you did, right, of course, we learned all about Masechet Zvachim, im alu yerdu, im alu lo yerdu. Once they get to the top of the mizbeach, you can leave them there, not this. What the Mishnah, when the Pasuk says, Vasiso osecha basar v'adam, adam, just pure meat, it's talking about when the sinews get separated, don't no longer bring them to the top of the mizbeach. When they're part of the animal, bring them as part of the animal. If they get separated, don't bring them. Umantana de Shamisle de Amar Pershu Yerdu, and whose opinion is this, that once they get separated, take them down? Rebbe. It's the opinion of Rebbe. We're going to keep on going. It's just kind of an arichus. We're going to keep on going and we'll kind of wrap it up at the end. But this so far is the opinion of Rebbe. Let's just check in for a second that we're saying that so long as the sinews, not specifically the gid hanasheh yet, but the sinews are part of the animal, still connected, and they're in the legs. These sinews and nerves and stuff. As long as they're still in the limbs, take them up to the mizbeach, no problem. If they get separated, don't burn them on the mizbeach. Now, that's the opinion of Rebbe decided that we learn in the Brisa. Victor HaKohen is HaKol. Once again, working with the same psukim, that the Kohen burns everything on the mizbeach, l'rabbis, to include ha'atzomis ve'agidim, the bones, the sinews, v'akanayim atzlafayim, the horns and the hooves, v'afilu, pershu, and even if they got separated, this is the Tanakama, this is not Rebbe, and even if they got separated, hakol, everything. You bring everything to the top of the mizbeach, the limbs with the sinews in them. If the sinews get separated from them, bring them also. What about the other pasuk that says specifically basar, the meat, nothing else, no sinews, no bones. Bepoke in. That's talking about if once you've brought them to the top of the mizbeach, and as we said, even including sinews that may have gotten separated, you bring everything to the top of the mizbeach and you burn them there on the pyre. However, what if some of the meat and some of the sinews or whatever popped off of the pyre? So if they aren't yet properly burnt, so the meat, basar, the meat, if we're talking about meat, put it back on the pyre. But if sinews pop off of the pyre, you don't have to put them back. That's the difference. So we say Viktir HaKol, burn everything. It literally means everything. All of the limbs, including the sinews, and that's even sinews that got separated. When we say specifically basar v'adam, specifically meat, and nothing else, that's talking about whatever, if anything falls off of the pyre, so what do you have to return to the pyre? Basar, just meat, none of the other stuff. Any meat that falls off of the pyre, you put back on the pyre, but that doesn't apply to sinews and bones. That's the opinion of the Chachamim. So according to the Chachamim, even sinews that got separated would still be put on the pyre. If they fell off the pyre, you wouldn't have to put them back. But in sinews that got separated, you would still bring to the top of the pyre. Rebbe Omer says, Rebbe, as we saw earlier, Kosev Echad Omer, Viktir HaKohen es HaKol, Riba, right, that the Kohen will burn everything. V'Kosev Echad Omer, V'asisa olesecha basar ve'adam miyet, that specifically basar, not everything. Haketzad aso michubarin ya'ilu, as we saw earlier, Rabbi Shita, that so long as the sinews are still part of the limb, bring them up to the top of mizbeach pershu. But if the sinews got separated, afilu brosho sham mizbeach yerdu, you have to even take them down from the top of the mizbeach. You can't leave them there. You have to take them down, according to Rebbe. The Rabbanon, whereas the rabbis say, look, michubarin lo itztirkra. According to Rebbe, he's saying that when it says Viktir HaKohen es HaKol, according to Rebbe, you'll burn everything. That's talking about the sinews when they're still part of the limbs. Say the Chachamim, that doesn't need a pasuk. For example, you burn the head of an olah, even though it's got bones in it. So just like you burn the head of an olah with its bones, So also the rest of the limbs with whatever bones and sinews they may have in them. I don't need a pasuk to come to include that. Of course, that's included as part of the korban. Ki itzter kra. What do I need? What I need the pasuk to include? Everything. Lifarshu. For even if the sinews and the bones got separated from the limbs, according to Chacham, you'll still bring them to the top of the Mizbeach. The Rebbe, and according to Rebbe, here we go. The Rebbe Mechubarin de Atera lo itztich kra l'Rabuye. Says Rebbe, I agree with you. I agree with you. Just like you burn the head with all of its bones, you burn the limbs with all of its bones as well. I don't need a pasuk to teach me that. I do need the pasuk to teach me, however, to get hanasheh. That when we're talking about bringing up the limbs, even with their sinews, sure, the regular sinews there's no chiddush there. The chiddush is the get hanasheh. Lo itztich kra l'Rabuye ki itztich kra l'git hanasheh b'mechuber. The pasuk is teaching us that when you bring up the back legs of the animal, of a korban olah, and you're wondering, what about the git hanasheh? Do you have to remove it? You don't have to remove it. Everything is burnt, even the git hanasheh. The Rabbanan say, we disagree with you there. The Rabbanan quote a pasuk from Sefer Yechezkel, where he's describing korbanos, and he says, "Mimashke Yisrael," from which we learn mutter li Yisrael. Only that which is mutter to the Yidden can be brought in the Mizbeach. When the Chachamim say that you bring the limbs to the top of the Mizbeach with their sinews, and even if they got separated, you burn everything, even the sinews. That's talking about kosher sinews. Kosher sinews can be brought with the leg, even if they get separated from the leg, bring them all. Gid hanasheh, that's osir, not even as part of the leg, not at all. Rebbe says the pasuk saying to include the gid hanasheh, you could bring it with the leg. Chacham say no, that's for sure not. So only that which is mutter for Yid. No gid hanasheh. Rebbe says I don't agree. For example, we burn on the mizbeach chaylev. We're not allowed to eat chaylev, yet we burn on the mizbeach. Blood, we're not allowed to eat blood. We burn on the mizbeach. Chaylev and dam are both chiyuvei kares if we eat them, and yet they're burnt on the mizbeach. Same thing. Gid hanasheh as well. We're not allowed to eat it, but it's burnt on the mizbeach. V'rabanon mitzvosim b'chachshani. The rabbi said, no. Chaylev, dam, those are like the key elements of korbanos. Ki adamu b'nefesh yichaper, zrikas adam. That's a key element. It's the main element of a korban, is the blood. And the emurim, the burning of the chalavim for the Rabbanan Shalom, those are key elements of the korban. Of course, you can burn those on the mizbeach. The gid hanasheh, that's not a key element of the korban, and it's also you're not allowed to eat it. No, don't burn that on the mizbeach. Omer Rav Huna says, Rav Huna, gid hanasheh shel olah cholzo litapuach. So says Rav Huna, like the Chachamim, that what you do is, the Rambam explains, I think based on a Mishnah, even in Masechta Talmud, that what you do is you bring you have a korban olah, you break it up into its parts, you break it down, and you bring all the parts and you leave them on the ramp of the Mizbeach. There you add salt to them, and you bring them up to the top of the Mizbeach, and there you remove the sciatic nerve. Gid hanasheh shel olah cholzo l'tapuach. You remove the sciatic nerve, and you put on the tapuach in the middle of the mizbeach. On the top of the mizbeach, in the middle, there was a big pile of ash. All the korbanos being burnt, and there's ashes. There's all piled up in ashes, so says Rav Huna, at the top of the mizbeach, the sciatic nerve is removed and added to that big pile of ashes. What's called the tapuach. Rashi says, called tzibur gadol shemisalkin lo min hatzdadim kari tapuach. Any big pile of stuff that you remove from its size, you move it away from the side, like you have to shovel it away, I guess, is called a tapuach. Like a big pile of stuff. Now, so gid hanasheh says Rav Huna, gid hanasheh shel olah cholzo tapuach. Amar Rav Chizda, Mari Dichi. Rav Chizda says, what is this? Miksiv al kain lo yochal hamizbeach. The pasuk does not say, therefore, the Mizbeach should not consume the gid hanasheh. Aken lo yochel b'nei Yisrael ksiv. The Yidden don't consume the gid hanasheh. People don't consume the gid hanasheh. It's not a problem for the mizbeach to consume a gid hanasheh. You don't have to remove it. Rav Huna mimashki so and amutali so. Rav Huna quotes the pasuk that the Chachamim quoted from Sefer Yechezkel, from which we learn only that which is mutter for yidden can be burnt to the mizbeach. Meisvei, we have a kasha gid hanasheh shel shlomim, a gid hanasheh of shlomim. Mechabdu la'ama, you sweep into the amma. The amma was a stream that ran through the Azara. And so the gid hanasheh you would remove and push into the stream so that it could be removed from the Azara. Rashi and Tosfos both asked the question, why would you be removing the gid hanasheh of a shlomim in the Azara? Shlomim could be in anywhere in Yerushalayim. So Rashi suggests you could change the text from shlom to chatas and oshum. So if you have a chatas or an oshum, that tafka has to be eaten in the azara, and you would remove the gid hanasheh from the meat of the chatas and oshum, and that would go into the amma, and all that's in the azara. Alternatively, both Rashi and Tosfos suggest it could be talking about the matnos guna, right? For example, so korban shlomim, the kohanim get the chazav ashok, the breast and the shok, the thigh, the back right shok, which is the thigh and the shank, and therefore they would remove the sciatic nerve from what they received, and that would go into the amma. Alternatively, it could be talking about, Tosfos says, kohanim who brought korban shlomims, and they would eat it in the azar because they were there in the azar. Anyways, so it is an interesting question about why would you be removing the sciatic nerve in the azar for korban shlomim. We gave a few answers. Now, b'chabdu la'ama, that would go into the stream in the azar from where it would be removed from the azar. Now, v'shel olah ma'aleu, and the sciatic nerve of a korban olah, you just bring to the top of the mizbeach. Ma'alav ma'aleu umikatro. Does that not mean that you're going to bring it to the top of the mizbeach and burn it there, like Rebbe says? Lo ma'aleu v'cholso. No, you bring it to the top of the mizbeach, and there you remove the sciatic nerve at the top of the mizbeach. Well, if you're just going to remove it at the top of the mizbeach, so why bring it up to the top of the mizbeach just to remove it? Why don't you remove it before bring it to the top of the mizbeach? Mishum shenemar hakriveu no lefecha secho. Pasuk in Malachi that the Rebbeinu Shalom is giving musar to the Yidden, and he says, "You offer what does the pasuk say? V'chisagishun iver d'zbayach ein ra." You offer blind animals, v'chisagishu piseach v'chole, sick, lame animals, ein ra, and you say nishgefel chakriveu no lefecha secha. Try getting away with that to your governor. Hayitzcho hayisa fanecha amar shem tzvakis. That we learn from that pasuk that whatever you're burning on the mizbeach, you want to be amazing. You want to be able to offer it to your governor, somebody you need to impress, and therefore, if you're removing the sciatic nerve from the meat before bringing it to the top of the mizbeach, you're bringing a piece of meat that's already been worked through. That's not nice. You want to bring a good shalom limb. So therefore, you bring it to the top of the mizbeach shalom and gishmak, and there you remove the sciatic nerve. So we say, like the Chachamim, ultimately we resolve that brisa to be like the Chachamim, that you bring the legs to the top of the mizbeach and remove the sciatic nerve before burning them. Tanya kavase de Rav Huna, and we have a brisa like Rav Huna, gid hanasheh shel shlomim, that the gid hanasheh of a korban shlomim michabdu la'ama, you sweep it into the amma so it can be removed from the azar. V'shel olah chotzo the tapuach, the olah, you remove it at the top of the mizbeach and add it to the pile of ashes, to the tapuach. Okay, so what have we seen? We've seen a machlokes between Rebbe and the Chachamim with regard to whether the sciatic nerve of a korban olah is brought to the top of the mizbeach, like Rebbe says, as long as it's still part of the limb. But the Chachamim disagree, and they say that you got to remove the sciatic nerve from the limbs. You can't burn it on the mizbeach, as we saw that Rav Huna expressed that view that you would remove the sciatic nerve at the top of the mizbeach and add it to the tapuach before burning the limbs of the olah. All right, and now for the rest of the daf, we just have some kind of agadita-y kind of stuff. All right. So now also we learn in a Mishnah in Masechta Talmud, tapuach be'emsa mizbeach, that the tapuach, where they would gather all of the ashes from the korbanos that was in the middle of the altar, olav kishlosh meos kor, and sometimes there was so much ash on the tapuach that it was 300 kor. Have you know how much 300 kor is? It's a lot. 300 kor is a lot. It's 6 eggs in one log, 4 logs in one cob, 6 cobs to a sa'ah, 30 sa'ah to a kor, 300 kors to 300 kors. I don't know what the math adds up there, but it's a lot. Rava Guzma, Rava says it's an exaggeration. It doesn't literally mean that humongous amount of ash. Hishku es atomid because Shalzav, another Mishnah in Masechta Talmud says that before slaughtering the korban tamid, they would give the sheep water to drink from a golden cup. Rava Guzma, Rava says that is also an exaggeration. Amr Ami says, Babi, Dibra Torah Lashon Avoy, the Torah speaks in exaggeration. Dibru Neviim Lashon Avoy, the prophets speak in exaggeration. Dibru Chachamim Lashon Avoy, and the Chachamim also spoke in exaggeration. Dibru Chacham Lashon Avoy Ada Amorin. The Chachamim speaking in exaggeration, as we just demonstrated with the golden cup and the 300 kor of ash on the tapuach. Dibur Torah Lashon Avoy Arim Gedolos Uvturas Bashamoyim. The Torah describes that the Yidden, after hearing the report from the spies about Eretz Yisrael, they came and they said, Moshe Rabbeinu gives Musar in, what was that, Sefer Devarim? In Parshas Devarim, that you came back and you said that there is cities that are so big and guarded, with walls up to the heavens. Exaggeration. Dibur Neviim Lashon Avoy Vatibaka Aretz Lekolam. That after King Solomon was coronated as king, the people were celebrating and in an uproar that the land split open to their uproar. Also an exaggeration. Amr Yitzchak bar Nachmani, Amr Shmuel, B'shloshim makomos dibu chacham lashon avoy. In 3 places, the chacham exaggerated. Eluein dizalem tapuach, gefen, uparoches. Tapuach adamarin. Tapuach, as we said earlier, that it was 300 kor of ashes. That's an exaggeration, right? Tosfos points out. Does Rashi also point out? Yeah, Rashi and Tosfos point out that over here we're leaving out the golden cup because actually, according to this, there actually was a golden cup, right? The concept of which we learned about in Ashirus, in Anius b'makom Ashirus. There's no poverty in a place of wealth. The Beis Hamikdash is a place of wealth, and it is no surprise that they give sheep to drink from golden cups. Gefen, and what is the exaggeration by the grapes? The Tanan that we learned in a Mishnah in Midos. Gefen shel zav oisa omedes al pischo shel eichel. That by the opening, by the entrance to the sanctuary in the Beis Hamikdash, there were golden clusters of grapes, these elaborate golden grape vines around the entrance to the Heichal, as we're going to learn about when we learn Masechta Midos. Mamish, as we get to the finish line of Shas, we're going to learn a few Masechtas of Mishnayos. Mishnayos Kinim, Masechta Talmud, I guess, has a little bit of Gemara there as well, and Midos. Anyway, so we're going to learn about these clusters of golden grapevines by the entrance to the Heichal, umudla agabe klonsos, and they were on these pegs. They're resting on pegs. V'chol misha oya misnadev gargir or eshkol, and anybody who would donate either a grape or a cluster of grapes to add to these vines, maybe would bring vitoleba and add them to the vines. And this elaborate kind of grapevines were adorning the entrance to the Heichel. Omar Reb Elazar Reb Tzadok Maisa, one time, one time, it took 300 Kohanim when they had to move this elaborate ornamental golden grapevine. The 300 was an exaggeration. 300 in Shas is often a number of exaggeration. Paroches, and finally the paroches, the Tanan, Reb Shimon Gamliel Omer Mishum Reb Shimon Askan, paroches ovya tefach. The paroches, Rashi prefers the explanation to say that this is the paroches separating between the kodesh and the kodesh kodashim. Its thickness was a tefach thick. The al shibim v'shnayim nirim ne'eregis, and its heddle, in its loom, in the loom that they used to weave the paroches, there were 72 openings in its heddle. Basically, a heddle is like a part of a loom that goes up and down, whatever. 72 holes in the heddle, that's a lot. And each thread was made up of 24 sub-threads. Orka arboim, and it was 40 amas tall, ba'ama v'roch ba'esim ba'ama, 20 amas wide. That was the size of the doorway into between the kodesh and the kodesh kodashim, or this was really a curtain. Umishmonim v'shtei ribo, from 820,000 nices. The question is, 820,000 what? I don't know, maybe smaller threads, or it could even be like women that were working on making it. Vishtayim osam b'shana, they would make 2 of these, right? Like rivos is like young women that were making them, and 2 of these paroches were made every year. V'shlosh me'os kohanim atbilin also, and it would take 300 kohanim in order to, when they had to put it in the mikvah, it would take 300 kohanim to do that task. Again, the 300 was an exaggeration. Friends, that was Daf Tzadi of Masechta Chullin. On Daf Tzadi of Masechta Chullin, we really got moving here on Perek Gid Hanasheh. We learned about how Gid Hanasheh applies to kodashim. We went through all sorts of suggestions until we landed at these 2 suggestions. Either it's talking about a bechor that while it is being developed, that while it is developing inside the mother, it already has a gid hanasheh, and that the gid hanasheh already applies to the fetus, and the kedusha of the bechor kicks in as it is being born, and now you have the kedusha of the bechor and the gid hanasheh. And if you eat the gid hanasheh of this bechor without offering it as a korban, you will be in violation of getting benefit from a korban, as well as eating the gid hanasheh. Alternatively, it could be talking about if you were makdish a animal to be, right, an to be a shlamim, and then it had a baby, and we assume that the kedusha of that baby also kicks in as it's being born. So you had the gid hanasheh from when it was a fetus, plus the kedusha. And once again, if you eat that gid hanasheh, you'd be in violation of eating the gid hanasheh, as well as getting benefit from kodashim. And finally, the second section, then we discussed how gid hanasheh applies to olahs. Essentially, we saw machlokes between the chachamim and Rebbe. According to Rebbe, the gid hanasheh is also by olah only if the gid hanasheh gets separated, right? So you offer all of the parts of the olah, and the back leg, the hind legs, you offer with the gid hanasheh inside. If the gid hanasheh gets separated, then you have to take that down from the mizbeach. The chacham say, no, you have to remove the gid hanasheh. You can't, even when it's in the leg, you can't be burning that on the mizbeach. You can't be burning something that's asur on the mizbeach. Rather, as Rav Huna described, you remove the gid hanasheh from the leg at the top of the mizbeach and add it to the tapuach, the big pile of ash at the top of the mizbeach. And then at the end of the daf, we got to some kind of like different Exaggerates kind of stuff about different places where Torah, Nevi'im, Chachamim used exaggeration. Friends, that was Daf Tzadi, Daf 90 of Masechta Chullin. Hope you enjoyed. Have a great day. Cheers.